Hello and welcome to the Controversies in Church History podcast. My name is Derek Taylor, your host for this podcast. This is a reminder that you can find controversies in church history on various social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and also on Patreon. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, this is a free podcast for most people. I try to make it available as many platforms and different types of social media as I can, but I do actually try to advertise every once in a while. I do have a few expenses for doing this, and it is a lot of work. So this is supposed to be a service. You're not supposed to you don't have to do this, but if you'd like to become a patron of our podcast, go to patreon.com and you'll find our Patreon page on Patreon, where you can become a donor, a monthly donor. I think it's $5, $7, and $10 to help out defray some of the cost of this stuff. Going forward, I'm going to start doing more things, interviews of those sorts of nature for patrons on Patreon, to focus more on that. So if you want to keep supporting the podcast, keep it going. All the episodes, in terms of the archive of what I've done, will be available free. Eventually, we made after a month or so all the new ones, but if you become a patron, you get new episodes a month in advance. You get some other things, bonus features that I won't make available. All the regular episodes will be available to all people. So just to help out and say thank you to some of my donors. So if you'd like to do that, please go to patreon.com and think about signing up. Thank you and God bless. Hello, and welcome again to Controversies in Church History, the podcast that takes you through the most important, interesting, and controversial events, ideas, persons, and other things in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. Welcome once again. My name is Derek Taylor, the host for this podcast. A reminder to all of you listening out there, you can find us on Spotify. We're hosted by Spotify for Podcasters. You can find us on pretty much all platforms you listen on, Apple Podcasts, etc., etc. Please, by the way, if you like the podcast, go to places like Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a message review if you like the podcast. Will help us try to spread the gospel of the podcast, as it were. Also can find me on social media, Facebook page, YouTube, Twitter, and on the web at churchcontroversies.com. I post original stuff there occasionally, links to other things that I write in other venues. So there is that for everyone. Welcome. Thank you to all of my listeners. Thank you to everyone out there for listening. It is now February, as I record this, February 6th in the year of our Lord, 2024. And so we're coming back to you. We're renewing our series on Latinization in this episode. Episode 8, Latinization 8, in which I'm calling a Ruthenian tragedy. So to start out this episode, recap, we just finished the last episode. We finished talking about the relationship of Rome vis-a-vis the Eastern Catholic churches in communion with it in the early modern period. And so we're starting the first episode of what will be probably 5 episodes, I think, on the modern period. And we're starting with the Ruthenian Catholic Church in America, late 19th, early 20th century. And for a variety of reasons, I'll get to those in a second. But just to bracket this and talk about the new era we're moving into, and this is new. I think we divide those periods, early modern. I think it makes sense for this topic, just because the changes that happened in Europe affect the Catholic Church, the Roman communion, so much. And of course, you're entering modernity with the 19th century, with all the revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, the French Revolution, all of its progeny, things like nationalism, the Risorgimento in Italy, the unification of Italy into a nation state, the rise of the nation state, really, as a sort of replacement for the church in a lot of countries. All these things really profoundly affect how Rome sees itself and what it's going to do in the 19th century. And just other changes, social changes like industrialization, just absolutely alters society, Western society, beyond all recognition. All these things are going to affect eventually the way that the Church of Rome deals with these Eastern churches, and other things like colonialism, because we'll get to that as well. Some of those things will come up in the course of the ensuing episodes. But all these things, these age revolutions, all these great revolutions, are going to make mark a change, I think, in the way Rome treats the Eastern Catholic churches. And the other thing that, of course, that's entering modernity is that its response is essentially what's sometimes called ultramontanism. I've talked about this in other podcasts. I'll repeat basics here, is that in reaction to the French Revolution, to other things like nationalism and the rise of the nation state and its claims over the church, you have this reaction which church leaders seek to centralize authority in the hands of the Pope. Centralization and Romanization is really the main sort of method for trying to deal with all these problems, that all these revolutions that I'd mentioned thrown up in the 19th century. Exaltation of papal authority, putting a lot more power in its hands, the bishops becoming much more tightly controlled by Rome in general. And this will lead up to, and it will feed into the calling of the First Vatican Council, of course, which emphasizes papal authority and defines papal infallibility and his primacy. So all these things are in the background we're talking about here. I won't mention this explicitly because you'll see we'll talk about this in another episode, but in the background here you have Rome reacting, just keep in mind, and I think slightly different, not totally different ways from the way it did in the early modern period, but definitely some differences I'll talk about later on in later episodes. And so we're talking about the Ruthenian Catholic Church. And if you've forgotten what this is, in the last episode we did talk about the Eastern Catholics, Slavic Eastern Rite Catholics, and the Ruthenian Catholics had existed under, until the late 18th century, both Austrian, Hungarian, and Polish rule in Europe, in Eastern Europe, until Poland became partitioned by the Austrian Habsburgs and the Russians in the 18th century. And so this separated the Ruthenian Catholic population under both Russian and Austrian rule in the 19th century. And in fact, the term Ruthenian is a term that came to be applied by the Austro-Hungarian state to any East Slavic peoples living in its domains. That means basically Belarusians, Ukrainians, and what we're calling Rusins or Carpatho-Rusins. And I need to explain that term because this is very confusing. Ruthenians were a church, but they weren't identified with one ethnic group necessarily in this period. It's only when you get to a later period they become identified with a single national identity. This is very confusing. The term Ruthenian, by the way, originated in the Middle Ages, a Latin term, which the Western Church uses as a generic term for all the Eastern Slavic peoples. The term Rusin, R-U-S-Y-N, is a term for the people associated with the Ruthenian Catholic Church. These are Eastern Slavic peoples who lived mostly in Galicia, which would be today Western Ukraine, and in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains in Ukraine and Poland, effectively. Although in the 19th century, they also would have been, technically speaking, in Hungary. And in fact, a lot of them will come under the influence of Hungarian culture. The Rusin people, by the way, are recognized today as a minority in Eastern Europe and many countries, in the Balkans, in Serbia, Croatia, Slovakia, but also in Hungary and Romania. There is an ethnic component, but it's not totally identified with the actual rite, which may be confusing, but keep that in mind. I'll try to keep that straight myself. This will change over time, however. There will be a nationalist movement. There are nationalist movements all across Europe in the 19th century, especially in the 1840s, among the subject peoples of Russia, inspired by nationalist feelings among people like Ukrainians, Poles, and so on and so forth. And in fact, there is a Rusin nationalist movement rises up in the 1840s. One of its prominent leaders is actually a Ruthenian Catholic priest, a guy named Alexander Dukovnich. So this will develop, by the end of the period, this has developed a Rusin national identity, but a lot of what we're talking about here are different Slavic peoples who identify with that rite. So it's, again, confusing, I know, but keep that in mind when I use the term. So what happens in the 1870s, beginning in the early 1870s, late 1860s maybe, Eastern Slavic peoples from Austria-Hungary began immigrating to the United States, mostly to the northeastern United States, in particular the states of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, motivated by economic concerns. Many of these peoples, including the people we're going to call Rusin or Ruthenian, came from those areas for economic reasons. And a lot of them didn't come, by the way, and this is typical of immigrants, a lot of immigrants in the 19th and 20th century. They came not really intending to settle permanently. They wanted to make money and then go back home. And like a lot of immigrant workers, they were really despised by native workers because they worked for lower salaries, and they would work as replacements during strikes as well. So this is part of that general immigrant experience. However, a big different thing about the Rusin and the Ruthenian Catholics we're talking about here. A couple of things to note here is that most of the Ruthenians who came to America were, in general, kind of illiterate, poor, single, and usually male. But unlike a lot of the people who came, Poles, Ukrainians, other people, they did not have, as I mentioned before, as great a sense of national identity. Tended to be more loyal to their village back home. And crucially here, whereas, again, being Polish and being Catholic went together, and being Russian and being Orthodox went together, these immigrants didn't really have that sort of identification, either in strict, again, theological terms, because, again, I need to stress this, I'll stress this several times throughout this podcast, most of these immigrants probably didn't have a real great grasp as to what separated Catholic and Orthodox Christians. What they did know was their liturgical traditions. These are the things that they identified with, more so than even at this point. Again, this will change by the time you get to the 20th century, what we'd call nationality. Again, confusing, I know, but it's crucial because their liturgy is really central to their identity, and it helps explain what happens here, because it's not something, as we're going to see, that the Latin Rite bishops of America understand, or unfortunately were willing to understand. So they begin coming in the 1880s, by the 1870s. By the 1880s, you have enough of these Ruthenians in America to catch the attention of the Latin bishops. And from the beginning, the Latin bishops don't like them for a variety of reasons. One of which is that there's a tradition, this kind of goes back to all the Slavic peoples. If you remember my podcast on the Union of Brest I did way back, things like lay brotherhoods were important in the Ukrainian, the Ukrainian and Ruthenian Catholic experience. And one thing that really Latin bishops did not like was the independence of the Ruthenian laity. The first immigrants, when they came to America, Ruthenians, worshipped in Latin Rite churches, usually Polish ones. They soon began petitioning their eparchies, the equivalent of diocese, back in Carpathia, for priests to celebrate their own liturgy, their Ruthenian liturgy, the Byzantine liturgy. Latin bishops resented this because they basically denied their jurisdiction over them, which they felt they had, and this is going to be one of the main conflicts. I should note as well, by the way, again, when I'm talking about these immigrants, a lot of them are coming from Hungary, as well as what we could say today as, Carpathian Mountains in Ukraine. So I mentioned it also because many of the priests who come to the United States were of Hungarian origin, so that's something to keep in mind. But more than this, the Ruthenian laity had a lot more control on the ground than did the clergy in the Ruthenian Church, and certainly more than they did in the Latin Rite. Lay committees often controlled parishes, building and owning the houses of worship. They also paid priests salaries rather than their eparchies back home. And this is a huge difference, right? One of the things that happened, in the 19th century, if you're not aware of it, there was it took most of the century, a big knockdown, drag-out conflict between the laity and the clergy in the Catholic Church and the Latin Rite over control of parishes. The priest eventually prevailed. And so, the arrival of Ruthenians who do control the laity, who do control their own parishes, just did not endear them to the Latin Rite bishops, who were like, we just got done with this problem in their own mind. But it's a very different, it's not a theological thing, but it's just, different culture, right? Eastern Catholic churches, Eastern churches in general, don't have the same strong sense of governance that the Latin Church does. They're not used to obeying or being expected to obey like Latin Rite Catholics are. And this became a problem early on with the first priest I could find, the first Ruthenian priest who comes from to America as early as 1885. there was already serious problems with the American hierarchy. The guy's name was Jan Wolanski, obviously Polish by background. Had a run-in with Archbishop Patrick Ryan of Philadelphia, and he wrote a letter to the Archbishop in 1885, basically complaining about many things. One is that first he forbade Wolanski to serve Ruthenian immigrants, and he just ignored him. So that was the first thing. The second thing is that he complained because Wolanski was married. If you don't know, Eastern Rite priests have tradition of married clergy, and this will be one of the major points of conflict for the Latin bishops. They say that it caused scandal among the mostly Irish and German Catholics in the United States, who were kind of horrified by it. And finally, one other thing he mentioned, also gets mentioned. I did not know this before I did this podcast. He was worried, was Archbishop Ryan, because there had been several people showing up in the United States claiming to be priests, taking money from parishes, who turned out to be imposters. Some of them were Jews from Eastern Europe. So you have these priests coming, you don't know where they're from, you don't really recognize they're ordinary. Oh, wait. Again, I'm not saying this is a great excuse for what happened. It's not, but it is there's some crazy things on the ground 19th century. So it's an interesting to say the least. Point is, this first letter really sets the pattern for nearly every single bishop, for every single complaint they have about the Ruthenians and their clergy, the lack of recognition of their jurisdiction, the unwillingness of Ruthenian clergy to heed their authority, and above all, the scandal of married priests. This is something they harp on constantly. I'll come back to this just to reiterate it later. But the American bishops did have other concerns, and I want to lay these out. And again, I lay this out just for the sake of doing my due diligence. Besides those things, one of the things that you have, and you obviously have different customs, right? Married clergy, difference of liturgies. And one of the things that happens with the American bishops is that they appeal to the superiority of Roman discipline, Roman customs. The idea being that because Rome has universal jurisdiction, and they make this argument, by the way, in letters to Rome, to the Propaganda Fide, we'll get to that in a second, that, well, and remember, when I say this, we talk about this here, the Ruthenians and the Ukrainians had signed decrees of union with Rome, which guaranteed them their customs, including married clergy. And the argument they make, and which Rome accepts, is that, well, because Rome has universal jurisdiction outside their homeland, outside Ruthenia, outside Ukraine, that their disciplines need to be subordinated to the Western ones. That's one thing. Another concern they have is, and this is something, these are more, the other major concern, as we already mentioned, is the problem of jurisdictions. American bishops wanted to exercise control over all Catholics in their diocese. They deeply, deeply resented the Ruthenian priests who ignored this. And the Ruthenians, by the way, because they resided in what was then considered mission territory, were under the authority of the Propaganda de Fide. Remember that body that had been set up in the 1620s by Rome to oversee its overseas missions. And so this is the body that both the American bishops, but also the Ruthenian bishops back in Europe, in Hungary and Galicia, in Ukraine, they're appealing to this body. So keep that in mind. But there were also cultural things that would feed into the response of the American Latin Rite bishops. And by the way, again, none of this excuses what they did, by the way. What they did was bad. But one of them is they were concerned, the American bishops were really highly sensitive to criticisms from what was, back then, the wider Anglo-Saxon evangelical Protestant society. They were very desirous for their immigrant flocks to assimilate and make good in modern American society. It's hard to overstate it now, but people really, really look down on Catholics as a bunch of ignorant, stupid, ethnic types who weren't deserving of respect. And this really powerfully affected and motivated a lot of American bishops, many of whom, by the way, were Irish. In fact, someone actually I came across this in one of these articles I read for this, referred to the American hierarchy of the 19th century in America as the hibernarchy, that is the Irish hierarchy. And the Irish in particular were sensitive to this because that was the way they were seen back in the old world, as a bunch of just deeply ignorant people, and that's why they kept their stupid old religion. And so they were really sensitive to this, and they were afraid Ruthenians would make them look bad in a way. Although, by the way, from what I can gather from reading about this, I don't think Protestants even knew they existed. But this was a real fear among some of the bishops, some of whom, by the way, were really keen on the idea of adapting to modern American society. The other concern, which was, I think, a little more pressing and makes a little more sense of the bishops, is our concerns about ethnicity and nationalism. One of the things the American bishops will cite in their letters to the Propaganda Fide about the Ruthenians is the problem of reconciling different customs among their flock in America as a reason for not accommodating the Ruthenians. And you have to remember this. There are a lot of there's Irish, Italian, Germans, Poles, and they're all, like, if you know the history of the 19th century church, there's a lot of conflict between these groups. It's not like they're all getting along all that well. Even among the bishops, there's serious conflicts between the Irish and German bishops, which are the two most well-represented groups in the hierarchy. But just to give you one example of this, there was actually a schism of Polish Catholics in Pennsylvania in the late 19th or 20th centuries. A group of them in Pennsylvania broke away around the turn of the century and formed the Polish National Catholic Church, which, if I'm not mistaken, still exists. And they had a bishop ordained by the Old Catholic Church of Utrecht, another schismatic body, in 1907. Now, these American bishops, again, they didn't really understand the distinction between the cultural traditions of the Ruthenian Catholics and the importance of their liturgical rite, which, of course, was guaranteed to them by the Union of Uzelrode, which was the union they signed in 1646, going into communion with Rome. And what it meant to them as their identity. It was more important than their ethnic concerns. And bishops like John Ireland, we'll get to in a second, James Gibbon of Baltimore, they tended to conflate these things or regard everything that they held on to as just mere custom. This wasn't mere custom for them. It was really central to who they were theologically. However, this was, I think, a legitimate concern because one of the things I came across in reading this, it appears that the Ruthenian bishops, the Ruthenian Catholic priests who are engaged in these, back and forth with the bishops in America and Rome, they seemed to think they were being singled out, as if every other immigrant group was getting exactly what they wanted from the American bishops, and that's not the case. Definitely not the case. So there's a lot of misunderstanding here. Again, I'm not going to hide this from you. The blame mostly goes to the American bishops here, but there's a lot of misunderstanding is the point. In any event, by 1890, the American bishops have been bombarding the Propaganda Fide for years with letters asking for greater control over the Ruthenian priests, asking for the removal of married priests from America. And so this brings us to the actual sort of tragedy in all this, which, if you do not know, centers around a priest named Alexius Toth, who was a Ruthenian priest of Hungarian descent, grew up there. Very different than many of the other priests who came to America in that he was highly educated. He taught canon law and church history at a Ruthenian seminary in Hungary. I believe had been a chancellor of diocese, if I'm not mistaken, or the eparchy for one of the bishops back in Hungary. So he was someone who knew Roman canon law well. And so he comes to America in 1889. He's made pastor at St. Mary's Parish in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is composed of Ruthenian Catholics mostly from Slovakia. So again, you see this different ethnic element here. And so what happens is you're going to have the Propaganda Fide has instructed all Ruthenian priests to present letters to the local Latin ordinary, submitting to their jurisdiction. Even though, by the way, most of them are all the ones who are married are almost all rejected by their Latin ordinaries. There's a lot of confusion on the ground, is my point. Many of these were unsure of their canonical status, but thought they were still tied to their bishops back home in Austria-Hungary, and so therefore just ignored the Latin bishops. Toth, again, probably because he knew the canon law better, organized a meeting of Ruthenian priests in 1890 to sort of protest some of these things that are happening with the Ruthenian clergy, and they sort of issue demands to a certain degree, and take a pretty hard line. Toth is from the very beginning someone who sort of actively seeks to sort of to make the case for these Ruthenian priests. And I'll give you, this is the, excuse me, from this document I guess they drew up, they have pointing criticisms of the American bishops. And it says this, quote, this is the quotation from this, at least an account of this meeting at Wilkes Barre in Pennsylvania, 1890, headed by Alexis Toth. Quote, the intolerance and total ignorance of the American bishops and their priests, as well as their disrespect of our Greek Catholic rite, Greek Catholic rite is what they call the rite, compel us to beg the Metropolitan of Lviv and the Bishop of, I cannot pronounce these names, Mukachevo and Preshov, that they, our rightful masters and reverend lords of bishops back in Europe, not surrender us to the power of the American bishops, since their negative influence can only harm our Greek Catholic tradition and draw our faithful into the Latin rite. In order to preserve our Greek Catholic rite in all its purity and the union with the Roman Catholic Church, we need to consolidate our priests and parishes. This is hardly possible unless we are placed under the jurisdiction of our own Greek Catholic bishop, unquote. They go on basically to ask Rome, quote, above all, I humbly request that only married priests be sent to America. Our faithful only want this type of priest, and the terms of union are upheld, since they too permitted married clergy, unquote. And so, in other words, you have him, and this is Toth doing, the other priests, there's only like 8 or 9 of them go along with him, try to do this. Later that year, he is called to meet with his ordinary, the local Latin ordinary. And again, the propaganda had instructed priests to do this. Toth does this. And his ordinary in this case is Bishop John Ireland of Minneapolis, Minnesota, in December of 1890. And we need to understand who John Ireland was. If you've been listening to my podcast, you may remember that name, because John Ireland was what is later to be called an Americanist. Americanism is the heretical tendency to want to adapt to modern American society in ways that are maybe too fulsome or too enthusiastic. John Ireland was someone who wanted his flock, if they were Irish, to assimilate to a modern American society. He was considered to be at the time, and is considered to be now, kind of a liberal, progressive prelate. And John Ireland, probably more than any other bishops, despised the Ruthenians for a lot of reasons. Now, we only have Toth's account of what happened in the meeting. There's no correspondence or writing of Ireland mentions that I could find. But Toth later claimed that Ireland forbade him to exercise any ministry among the Ruthenians, and that his Ruthenian flock should actually just go to the local Latin rite priest instead. And as you're going to see, by the way, Bishop Ireland will be one of the most insistent among the American bishops, who not only wants to get rid of married priests, he basically wants to will actually ask Rome to basically make all the Ruthenians Latin rite. So Ireland's one of the major sort of antagonists in this, in terms of against the Ruthenians. What happened is, one of the reasons, probably the reason by this time that Ireland reacted so badly to Toth, to be fair, is that even before that meeting, Toth had already been in contact with the Russian Orthodox Church in America. The Russian Orthodox Church in America in that period was basically a tiny mission based in Alaska and then San Francisco, probably no more than like 10, 15,000 members maybe, or so. I didn't find exact numbers, but it seems the only number I could find. And but who was active, this mission, this Orthodox mission, trying to convert, first of all, Native Americans in Alaska, Protestants, but also does later target Ruthenians and other Eastern Catholics in the eastern United States. And so what happened is in 1890, Toth sent a layman from his Minneapolis parish, a guy named John Milnar, to San Francisco to make contact with the bishop there, the Orthodox bishop Vladimir Sokolovsky. And again, to reiterate this, I mentioned this earlier, there's a lot of confusion on the ground between, what constitutes a Ruthenian Catholic and a Russian Orthodox Christian. Because a lot of these distinctions, in abstract terms, many Ruthenians were not actually clear about. And to illustrate this, there's a story about, again, there's different sources about what happened, this interchange between Toth and the bishop and his intermediary. But one source tells this, again, I'm not, the historian I got this from was a little bit skeptical of this, which is probably right, but I'll tell the story anyway because it illustrates this point. According to one source, when John Milner went to the Orthodox Cathedral in San Francisco, he tried to take communion. But when he went up to communion, the proto-deacon who was there, assisting at the liturgy, noticed him touching his fingers to his breast twice as he crossed himself. And this is something, by the way, if you don't know, Orthodox don't do that. And so they immediately accused him of being a uniat and sent him to the Roman Catholic bishop of San Francisco. When Milnar told the Catholic bishop he was a uniat, supposedly he sent Milnar back to the Orthodox Cathedral. And according to this source, Milnar wrote it back to Toth in Minneapolis asking him, quote, "What religion are we anyway?" And again, I think the idea that the Catholic bishop sent him back sounds a little sketchy. But it's pretty funny anyway. Gives you an idea, again, how fluid this situation is on the ground. In any event, Toth eventually corresponded with Bishop Vladimir himself. And when Bishop Vladimir visited the parish in Minneapolis in 1891, on the Feast of Triumph of Orthodoxy in the Orthodox calendar, received both Toth and most of that parish into the Russian Orthodox Church. I should mention this, that a lot of the American sources at the time, both Latin and Ruthenian, make constant accusations about Russian imperial agents, funding efforts to convert Ruthenians, giving money to the Orthodox mission, being on the ground there. And but from what I can tell, at least Constantine Simons, one of the major historians I consulted for this, is a Jesuit. There's really no evidence to support this. They actually didn't support the mission much at all, the Russian government. Certainly, the Russian Orthodox mission was trying to convert Ruthenians, but they received very little financial aid from the Russian Empire. I know at one point the parish in Minnesota that came into Orthodoxy received some icons and some other liturgical items from the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, but that's about it. So again, there's all these geopolitical things in the background of this as well. All did not go well for Toth in Minneapolis, however. According to a letter of his in 1882, he petitioned his new bishop for an assistant priest. However, when that priest arrived, he eventually turned his parishioners against him and effectively took over control of the parish because, according to Toth, they wanted a Russian priest and not a Hungarian one. Again, ethnic problems on both sides of the Tiber, apparently. In any event, apparently he left. We're not really sure. Seemings to be the reason why. He leaves Minneapolis and goes to Pennsylvania, where he persuades the Ruthenian parish of Wilkes-Barre, which at that point was one of these lay-controlled parishes, which was not recognized by the local Catholic bishop, to enter the Russian Orthodox Church in December of 1892. Eventually, by the way, this whole issue was litigated in the civil courts, and the parish eventually returned to communion with Rome. However, from that point on, to the end of his days, Toth became an apostle, a sort of propagandist for the Orthodox faith, and he convinced 17 more Ruthenian parishes in Pennsylvania, along with others in New York, New Jersey, and Illinois, to enter the Russian Orthodox Church. So you have this mass exodus of Ruthenians out of the church because of the policies of the American bishops. There is another priest meeting in 1891 at Hazleton in Pennsylvania by Ruthenian clergy, and they make the decision there to not leave the church but fight for recognition by Rome. Still very angry, still having complaints, but they still decide to stay. I should mention this before, Alexis Toth does get several priests to come over from the Ruthenian clergy. They eventually all return to the Catholic Church before their deaths. But most of those people that leave, the parishioners that leave, don't come back. So what's the response to this by the bishops in America, or by Rome, by the Ruthenian bishops back home? We'll start with the Ruthenian bishops in Europe. And this worried them greatly, obviously. They wrote to Rome expressing concern not only that the Ruthenian Church in America might go over to Orthodoxy, but also they were much more concerned, actually, that Russian agents in Europe might use it to proselytize among them in Galicia and in Hungary. Because there, unlike in America, the Russian government did materially support efforts to convert Ruthenian Catholics, and they did have some success, apparently. So they're worried that this is a spillover from the New World back into the Old. Other thing they do in Rite Rome to ask for is they make demands. Two primary demands they'll make for many years. One is to allow married priests into their territories, that they don't have enough. They simply don't. They just don't have enough widowers, celibate priests. What's going to happen later on, by the way, is that the Basilian order, which is an order created in the earlier period to minister to them, it's a Latin Rite order, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it's an Eastern Rite. I can't remember, but they'll supply some of these priests. But there just aren't enough celibate priests back home to fulfill the needs of the people in America. The second thing they ask for is a bishop or a vicar general, to oversee the Ruthenians in America, who will be under his jurisdiction, not those of the Latins. But this is kind of striking, because the Ruthenians, the Ukrainian Catholics, have, generally speaking, been faithful to Rome, been faithful to the unions they've signed for most of their time they've been in communion since the 16th century with Rome, 16th, 17th century with Rome. They went on to, in letters, criticize pretty harshly the Propaganda Fide for not giving enough help to Ruthenians both in America but also in England. There were also some in England as well. And pointed out that, unlike them, the Orthodox were always ready to give aid to people who converted to Orthodoxy. So you have this response on the part of the Ruthenians trying to stick up for them. Finally, and lastly, they also sent a letter to the Ruthenians in America, among other things, condemning Toth as a schismatic and a heretic. So what about the American bishops and the Propaganda Fide? What's their reaction to all this? And I have to single this out here. The Propaganda Fide's response to Toth's action was initially to issue an order recalling him back to Europe. That is to say, he's already gone over to Orthodoxy. They're issuing a command they think he's going to obey. And I harp on this because it displays a serious misunderstanding of Toth himself. Toth is really intelligent. Toth is learned. Toth is really kind of an activist. It also just misunderstands the situation on the ground, because I don't think they understood how fast people were actually going into Orthodoxy at that point. This is 1891 and 92 we're talking about here. And again, I mentioned this as an example of Rome's concerns are just not the concerns of the Eastern Catholics. Their concerns are for governance, for obedience to authority, for trying to reconcile jurisdictional conflicts, rather than understanding the various traditions and seeing them as legitimate. The Propaganda responded to the request of the Ruthenian bishops by denying the request for married priests. They required the recall of all married clergy from America, and they also refused to provide a vicariate or a vicar general for jurisdictional reasons, even though, by the way, the Ruthenian bishops in their letters had pointed out instances where Rome had done that in other places. So they could have done it. They didn't decide to do it. They went along with what the American bishops wanted. What did the American bishops want? I need to go and point some of this out. The American bishops wanted basically nothing less than the complete ending of the Ruthenian Rite in America, led by John Ireland. They not only asked for the recall of all priests, they actually asked Rome to basically let them force the Ruthenians to go to Latin Rite churches, which, by the way, if they had done that, every single Ruthenian would have gone over to Orthodoxy. Almost guarantee it. But just to emphasize this, need to show this here. Some of the attitudes of the American clergy, just to get an idea here. And again, I'm not saying, I'll give this. This is 1891. A Roman Catholic canon lawyer described the situation of these Ruthenians and the Greek Rite Catholics, generally speaking, in America. Read this here, quote. The Slavonic element must, in progress of time, lose much of its characteristic form and become Americanized, and this will also tend to eliminate the distinctive religious features in them, and whilst the Eastern habits and traditions make a perpetuation of this national side of religion a necessity and probably an advantage not easily compensated for at home, it is by no means so in this country, where the conditions of society and government make a harmonious activity on the part of all the citizens the only real guarantee of national peace and prosperity, unquote. In other words, because we need peace and prosperity, they need to have their traditions wiped out. Later on, another author writing in the Ecclesiastical Review, it's an American review, basically giving his argument in favor of the complete assimilation of the Ruthenians to the Latin Rite. He says, quote, "Compared with the Latin Rite, the Byzantine is and always will be in a state of inferiority. The Latin is universal, since it comprises many nationalities, none of which can claim the language of the sacred ceremonies as its own. The practice of the West, quote-unquote, is more in accordance with the general principles of Christianity. It is always pointing to the ideal of a universal church, not bounded by the narrow tenets of one or several nations. But wide is the world. Wherever a Catholic of the Latin Rite enters a church, he finds himself at home. The Oriental, if he is outside of the boundaries of his own country, is almost lost." Unquote. So that's one set of writers. Now, let me go on for 1 second. Just a couple more examples of this, so we can get this idea here. Basically, well, I'll just give you one last one. Basically, I'll give you the opinion, the final opinion, effectively, of the bishops, the American bishops. This is 1893. They were less than happy with the eventual decision of the propaganda, which I'll get to in a second. But this is their final statement, or one of their final statements about this. As a result of the discussion which ensued, the following resolution was unanimously adopted. "It is the solemn judgment of the archbishops of the United States that the presence of married priests of the Greek Rite in our midst is a constant menace to the chastity of our unmarried clergy, a source of scandal to the laity, and therefore the sooner this point of discipline is abolished before these evils attain large proportions, the better for religion, because the loss of a few souls of the Greek Rite bears no proportion to the blessings resulting from uniformity of discipline." Unquote. Suffice it to say, the propaganda gave them what they wanted in terms of married clergy, and this will remain a serious sore point for Eastern Rite Catholics of all stripes for a long time, until actually the current pontificate. However, the propaganda basically told the Latin bishops no when they asked them to stomp the Ruthenians out of existence. They pointed out to them that even though they wanted to have uniformity of jurisdiction as much as they could, they did not. It was not the policy of Rome. They had granted the use of their own right to these people. They were not going to go back on it, and pretty terse dismissal of that, which is about the only good thing you can say about what the propaganda did. They at least didn't go back on their word and allowed them still to continue to have their own right, which there were some people who kind of understood this in the propaganda, that the rite was the main thing for these Eastern Catholics. If they had just acceded to that and some of the other customs, there would have been no problems. They at least understood that the rite was important to them, if nothing else. So, aftermath of all this, and we're only going up, by the way, here to early 20th century, 1910, I think, the cutoff date I gave for this. This is not the end, unfortunately, of the exodus of the Ruthenians, but this is the biggest exodus here. And the upshot of all this is that effectively the Ruthenian exodus from the Catholic Church to Orthodoxy helps create the Orthodox Church in America. Quite frankly, there's not a really big Orthodox Church in America anyway. There probably wouldn't be, it'd be even less of one if it hadn't been for this episode. It's not exactly known. I couldn't find exact numbers, but the estimates are about as many as 100,000 Ruthenians left for Orthodoxy by the early 20th century, mostly because of Toths and other Orthodox efforts of conversion. I should point out, by the way, that at the time there were actually disagreements about how many Ruthenians were in America. The American bishops were convinced there were much fewer, something like 50,000, whereas the Ruthenian bishops back in Europe claimed there were like 150 to 200,000. And apparently propaganda took the Ruthenian bishops at their word. But again, it's part of this sort of, confusion on the ground. And I'll end with this. The story is that eventually one of the things that happened by the late 1890s is that the propaganda becomes less willing to accede to the request of the American bishops. And if you're wondering why they take their word so much, partly because they're dependent on it in a lot of ways. Rome's dependent on its bishops to get information about what's going on the ground. So they kind of, side with them. They know them better than these Ruthenians in a lot of ways. But by the end of the 1890s, the Americanist controversy begins to flare up in America and in Europe. And this leads to, because of this, the Propaganda Fide being less and less willing to accede to the requests of the American bishops with regards to Eastern Rite Catholics, Byzantine Rite Catholics in America. And maybe because of this, I don't know, wasn't able to find out, Rome does eventually give the Ruthenians what they want in 1907. They appoint a vicar general, not for them alone, but for all the Byzantine Rite Catholics in America, Bishop Soter Stephen Ortinsky, who's appointed in 1907, who is still, at least initially, under the jurisdiction of the Latin bishops. He eventually is made independent in his own right. And eventually, I'll go on this later on when we come back to this particular topic. They do eventually create eparchies in America for the Ruthenians. We'll stop there for a variety of reasons. And a couple of things to note about all this. One, and again, we've talked about this throughout this series, we're talking about multiculturalism and you respect traditions. And, when is tradition as a small t become big T tradition? When I think in some ways here is that, you have just in general, maybe the idea of tradition is just more important to these Ruthenians than it was to the Catholic, at least their own traditions, right? They couldn't see them as part of the Church universal. And Rome's, sense of its own universality sort of prevented, especially the American bishops, who of course had other things in mind, right? They're thinking about their own jurisdiction. They're thinking about their own problems. They're not thinking about the problems of this minority who they don't like very much. And that's clearly in the background here. And we have to mention this. Again, I'm not trying to exculpate Rome here, but the main blame lies on the American bishops. Their prejudices. I think it's the fact that they were Irish, most of them, makes a difference. I think a lot of them probably associated they really hated married clergy. And part of this goes back to the fact they're Irish, right? Who are their big opponents in the old world? It'd be English, who are Protestant, who have married clergy. So I think they just thought it was a reprehensible thing. It scandalized them. And it was so ingrained in Latin Rite Catholics' mind that and still is in a lot of ways, obviously, but they basically sacrificed, and you saw it, I would give that last quotation, because they basically sacrificed Ruthenians to gain peace in their own jurisdictions. That's what they did. It's terrible. Nothing else to say about it. Secondly, Rome. The propaganda didn't insist enough on the customs of the Ruthenians. They insisted on their right, and that allowed for their survival. So you can't, it's not the same thing as the American bishops who would have just Borg-like absorbed them all. But they should not have. They just simply should not have acceded to the American request about married priests. It wasn't as big a problem. I didn't get a sense of it. Like, again, jurisdictionally it was a problem, but I think a lot of it was, again, the idea that it would have just caused massive schisms of German and Irish Catholics just seems silly to me. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Maybe we weren't doing it. Again, they didn't have no reason to fear that. Went through that, but I just think it's overdone. And I think Rome should have pushed harder for them. They had a duty to. That's the terms of the union, right? Instead, they again, put it that way. And then finally, the last thing that, if you're talking about the blame for this, the first two mostly go those two. You have to tip your hat to the propaganda skills of Thoth. He was a real effective denouncer of uniat. He denounced the uniats and uniatism and all the sort of good rhetoric you hear from Orthodox. He was, I'm not going to call him the first of the ortho bros, if you know what this is, online stuff, but he's really good at that. He was an intelligent guy, obviously. Definitely knew the weak spots of the Roman Church because he knew it so well. So, but I'm going to end here. A couple of last observations. Obviously, my sympathies are with the Ruthenians and all this. I do think, again, you're going to see a lot of continuity, what Rome's done here and what it's done in the past. There's also a difference, and it's maybe totally apparent. It's not totally a total qualitative shift, but I think the emphasis is very different, is that I think this is partly reflected. One of the reasons why Rome, gives in to the American bishops on married priests and what they do is partly because of modern conditions. And I'll explain that better next time, because what we're going to do next time, I'm going to stop here. And next time what I'm going to do is next episode, there's about 4 or 5 more episodes. Next episode will be on papal policy toward the Eastern Catholics from 19th century onward, probably starting with Pius IX at least, and going up to the middle of the 20th century before Vatican II. And talk about why, because what happens, of course, if you don't know, and I'll preview it later, they begin to insist on this, that in mission territories everywhere, no Eastern Catholics can have married priests. And I think that's a shift. There's a shift going on there that needs to be explained. I have to do some inside baseball about Rome. So the next episode will be on that. After that, we're probably going to have an episode on the Middle East, and probably... there's so many things I could do. I don't have enough time, but I have one episode probably talking about, colonialism, and particularly the French and their protection of the Melkites and the Maronites in Syria and in Lebanon. After that, it'll be probably one on the Syro-Malabar Church in the 19th and 20th centuries up till the Second Vatican Council. And then finally, the last one we'll talk about Vatican II and its effect. One of the things that really was tried to do, Vatican II, was reverse a lot of this Latinization that happened historically speaking, what it did, what it didn't do. We'll probably have to talk about the still ongoing controversy in the Syro-Malabar Church in India, which is related to Vatican II. So what's that? 4 more? Vatican? 4 more after this. There'll be 4 more episodes. And the next one will be on papal policy as it changes in the 19th and 20th centuries. So that is it for this episode of Controversies in Church History. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. This was one that was long in the making. This was actually the episode, by the way, historical, I was thinking of when I started this series, so I wanted to get to it to start out the modern era. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you like it, and go, like and subscribe. Go to the social media page, like the pages, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Leave a comment somewhere if you can. I don't know if they have comments on Spotify. Go to Apple Podcast. Leave a review. Give it 5 stars if you like it. Help us out here. You can also go to and find us on the web as well, and on Twitter. Say hi if you want to do that. Reach out. Definitely reach out to me if you have feedback. I really need it. As much feedback as you can get. I'm going to try to take more feedback, get more feedback from you guys. And if you want to support the podcast, you can become a patron on our Patreon account. Thank you, by the way, to all the patrons. I'm going to probably have to do some advertising here pretty soon with your money. So thank you for that. Advertise the podcast, kind of spread the word. And be on the lookout for new episodes. Probably another standalone episode coming at some point as well, besides the next series episode. And for patrons only. If you're going to be a patron, probably in the next 3 weeks or so, there's going to be another interview. I think you'll like this. It's weird. A lot of my listeners are basically traditional Roman Catholics, but it's something off your radar. It'll be interesting for you, kind of different and unique. So look out for our second interview, and fun stuff upcoming. Please, everybody keep me in your prayers. I really appreciate it. You'll be in mine. God bless all my listeners and patrons and all you wonderful, lovely people out there. God bless you. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.